Hello and welcome. Aloha, Avelina mai I ke aloha. Hau'oli lo'au I ko o ko hele mai ana I ke ala. Hau'oli au ke la e kuka kuka me o ko. I am so pleased to welcome you to this webinar on the intersections of Indigenous and immigration histories. My name is David Aiona Chang. I'm professor in the Department of History with an affiliation with the Department of American Indian Studies here at the University of Minnesota. I am Kanaka Maoli, that is Native Hawaiian. This event is co-sponsored by the Immigration History Research Center and the American Indian Studies Department here at the University of Minnesota. The American Indian Studies Department is the oldest department of its kind in North America. It was founded in 1969 thanks to the demands of a mobilized Indigenous community and offers 3 BA programs and a PhD in American Indian and Indigenous Studies. The Immigration History Research Center offers an array of programming on migration and diaspora. Both AIS and IHRC's websites will be linked in the chat if you'd like more information. The IHRC is under the skilled direction of Professor Lana Barber. We have Professor Barber, Pat Baylor, and Maria Drange, and the rest of the IHRC staff to thank for today's important conversation. In this conversation, it is particularly appropriate for me to emphasize that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on the homelands of the Dakota people. Over the past 2 months, as you know, this Dakota land has burst into international attention due to the onslaught of U.S. federal forces. ICE, CBE, the FBI, and other agencies unleashed over 3,000 agents on the cities and the region. Thousands of people have been abducted, crowded into cells in Minnesota and Texas and elsewhere, and deported. The intersections of Indigenous history and immigration history are vivid in this story. The base of operations for this so-called Metro Surge on racialized migrants has been Fort Snelling. Fort Snelling is a site from which Washington has projected violent power over anyone, Native American or migrant, who gets in its way. Dakota people saw this in the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, when the U.S. deployed soldiers from Fort Snelling to do battle on them, when it forced Dakota women, children, and elders into a concentration camp down the bluff from the fort, when it expelled the Dakota from their homelands and oversaw the largest mass execution in U.S. history. And for decades to come after that, Fort Snelling was used to deploy troops to attack Native nations. And so we come now to 2026, when federal agents fanned out from Fort Snelling into neighborhoods, seizing peaceable people and hauling them back to crowded basement cells, and reserving the right to shoot anyone who got in their way. Since December, DICE has shot at least 13 people. Yes, we must of course say the names of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. We must also remember that as white native-born American citizens, they were the exceptions in this violence, which has largely targeted Latinx, African, and Asian people, but also American Indian people. Indeed, American Indian people belong at the heart of this immigration story. Federal agents have reportedly interrogated and seized tribal citizens. And Native people have pushed back in defense of themselves and their migrant neighbors, patrolling the street with whistles, delivering food aid to people sheltering in place, and erecting an encampment in the very face of the federal invaders at Fort Snelling. So it is deeply appropriate to host this conversation here at the University of Minnesota and convening this distinguished panel. I'd like to introduce you to them. Liz Ellis is an associate professor of history at Princeton University, where she teaches early American and Native American history, as well as Indigenous studies. She specializes in the 17th and 18th century Indigenous South and Midwest. She is a citizen of the Peoria tribe of Indians of Oklahoma, and she serves as the tribal history liaison for her nation. Fantasia Painter is an assistant professor in global and international studies at the University of California, Irvine. Her research, most recently published in the Journal of Arizona History and American Indian Culture and Research Journal, rethinks global borders, boundaries, and migrations from indigenous perspectives and worlds. Her current book project, Our Home is Not a Borderlands, reveals how border politics in southern Arizona are unfolding on Adham indigenous lands. She is an enrolled citizen of the Salt River Pima-Maricopa Indian community. Hana Maruyama, she, her, hers, is an assistant professor in the Department of Social and Critical Inquiry and History at the University of Connecticut. Her current book project examines the settler colonial underpinnings of Japanese American incarceration and the impacts on and responses by American Indians and Alaska Natives. She also directs the Fudeco project, which is in the process of developing a digital journaling program for Japanese American former incarcerees. Jorge Ramirez-Lopez is an assistant professor in the Department of Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a scholar of Indigenous and Latinx histories, immigration, social movements, and borderlands. He is currently working on his first book, titled Democracy from Below: The Communal Worlds Indigenous Migrants Created, that tells the story of how migrants from Oaxaca, Mexico, working in the United States, built a grassroots movement centered on indigenous rights, autonomy, and multi-ethnic and multiracial solidarity across borders. Ramirez-Lopez is indigenous Triqui with cultural and familial ties to the town of Putla. His family and roots are from the Mixteca region of Oaxaca. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Ellis.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks again to the IHRC team and to American Indian Studies. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening and to be in conversation with these stellar panelists. So I'm a historian, and I'm going to use my first 10 minutes, this introduction time, in order to talk a little bit about the importance of migration and naturalization, two concepts we don't often think of as corely linked to American Indian history, to my own nation's history, the Illinois people in the 17th and 18th century. And we will do this following one of the nations that becomes part of the Illinois Confederacy in this era. If we could go to my first slide, please. Because I am a historian, we're going to do this using a terrific early 18th century map. I love this map. It's sort of hilariously ambitious. If you look at the middle of the continent, you can see that the French cartographer has labeled almost all of the American interior as La Louisiane. He's claiming this territory for France. If we go to our next slide, which highlights the actual European inroads in about the mid-17th century, you'll see that the control Europeans had on the continent was much, much less. But nonetheless, let's return to the French map and the following slide, and we will dive right in. Next slide, please. Forward. Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. So right in the middle of what has been labeled La Louisiane is my nation in the early 18th century. The Illinois Confederacy, the people today who are known as the Peoria Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma, actually are not a single nation historically, but were a confederation of many different peoples. This included Peorias, Kaskaskias, Michigamias, Cahokias, Tamaroas, and then later in the 19th century, Piankashaws and Weas, our Miami relatives. I want to draw your attention to the lower left corner of this map where we have Michigamias circled in both yellow and red. Historically, the Michigamias were not part of the Illinois Confederacy, but it's migration and immigration policies that help us explain how they became part of our nation. We can go to the next slide, please. So in the mid-17th century, Illinois people, here circled in the map in red, were experiencing tremendous violence from multiple sets of directions. This was an era of rupture, of upheaval, and of change for my nation. In the 1650s and 1660s, or really between the 1640s and 1660s, we were fighting about four different conflicts. Here on the map, for example, if we look to the east to Haudenosaunee territory that was outlined in green with that purple arrow, Haudenosaunee folks who had made alliances with the English and who were in conflict with the French in the early and mid 17th century were pushing into the Midwest, into Miami, circled here in Periwinkle, and Illinois homelands. But we were not just fighting wars in the East, we were also raiding to the South and West, trading in bison furs and captives. We were fighting with our Meskwaki neighbors to the north, circled here in brown. And we had simultaneous conflicts in the 1640s and 1650s with Lakota and Dakota folks whose territories we crossed through to reach the French in the Great Lakes, as well as with Ho-Chunk folks who were up in the Great Lakes in that region. I say this to say there's a tremendous amount of conflict in the mid-continent in the 17th century. And what this does in practice is to create large numbers of refugees and migrants, people seeking to get out of the brunt of this violence and to find safe harbor. During this era, many of our Miami neighbors, again circled here in purple, go and seek refuge further north, up towards where the brown circles delineating Meskwaki homelands are. They ask for sanctuary with Meskwakis and also with Ho-Chunks. Even though their peoples had had histories of conflict, they understood that they were in crisis, they had to get out of the region, and many Miami people temporarily resettle in this region during this time period. But significantly for our story, this is also what brings the Michigamias into the Illinois nation. Originally located in the Ohio River Valley, sometime by the mid 17th century, Michigamia people had moved up to the Great Lakes. Around the 1740s or 1750s, in the midst of these conflicts, they had to flee the region and they moved down the Mississippi River. As they traveled, they sought refuge with multiple different native nations. And by the 1650s, 1660s, they arrived in Quapaw homelands, here circled in green along the Mississippi River. They probably approached the nation with a calumet pipe, which was a ceremonial pipe, and asked properly for refuge, for sanctuary, and for a temporary resettlement for their people. They clearly followed the correct protocols because Quapaw people accepted them into their nation and offered them refuge. They allowed them to live within their greater homelands, again here circled in green, a little bit north and east of their villages, and they were able to rebuild and reestablish themselves in this region. The rules of seeking resettlement are slightly different. Perhaps for Miami's seeking refuge with Ho-Chunks or Michigamias seeking refuge with Quapaws. But by and large, across interior North America, what we see is that Native people are able to resettle among foreign populations without sacrificing their autonomy. These Michigamia refugees continue to govern themselves. They don't have to change their customs. They don't have to change their language. They don't have to give up internal governance. They simply have to be good relatives, to respect shared resources like salt, water, fields, and to treat their hosts with respect. In 1673, when Joliet Marquette, French travelers, a missionary, and an explorer, moved down the Mississippi River, they find the Michigamias living among the Quapaw in a multinational settlement, meaning basically just two different nations living next to each other. Marquette actually records that it's very difficult to communicate with these people because no one in this village speaks Illinois or Miami, the languages of the guides who he's traveling with. And this is important because it would mark the Michigamias as distinct from and outsiders from Illinois people. It seems that the Michigamias did the same thing again in the 1680s when they moved back up the Mississippi River and sought refuge alongside my people. At this point, they asked if they could settle along Cahokias and Tamaroas. We can go to the next slide, please. They live along Cahokia and Tamaroa people for about a decade. By 1700, they're actually living alongside Kaskaskias, another group of Illinois people. Then we see them move back, and that's where they're featured in this map in the 1710s. The partial outline around the curve at the bottom there tells us that they were living with Tamaroas and Cahokias. This map is from 1718. And they had previously lived with the Michigamias in that village a little bit further to the east. So They had effectively, by this time, become part of the Illinois nation. They had been made from allies into kin. By the 1720s, the Michigamia leader, Chief Chicago, was serving as an international representative for the whole of the Illinois Confederacy in their dealings with the French. Everyone spoke Illinois. They painted themselves, they dressed as we did, they cut their hair as we did. They had become Illinois. So, what I've just outlined in very, very sketchy, very rapid format is a period of time over 50 years over which a people who were outsiders, refugees who held different customs and spoke a different language found refuge alongside four different native nations. First, Quapaws for temporary resettlement, and then ultimately made a decision based on extended practices of resettlement within Illinois to become part of our people. Next slide, please. So, what I think this tells us about early Illinois history is that sanctuary and resettlement practices helped protect migrants and refugees in crisis. They also provided options for eventual naturalization. So, integrating outsiders, especially in this violent and dangerous moment, helped to sustain the Illinois people. And Illinois people could see the bringing in of outsiders as a positive good, as something that strengthened our nation, brought people in, and helped us survive an otherwise really tumultuous era. And what I want to suggest is that this is actually part and parcel of larger national or at least continental customs of taking in people who were not historically part of our nation and our ability to make new kin. These were regular practices in this era. Indigenous peoples regularly provided sanctuary to those who looked different than them, spoke different languages. This did not always lead to integration, but it very well could, and it's part of how many of us make new kin and sustain our communities in times of crisis. This, of course, will sound very distinct from the ways that we think about American Indian peoples and American Indian history today, and certainly by the 19th century as racial exclusionary policies begin to categorize Native people as defined only by race or as having these much more rigid ways of figuring belonging within our nations. But looking back to this earlier era, again emphasizes the importance of migration and naturalization for the survival of Native people and the well-being of Indigenous nations. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to be here. Skagtash. My name is Fantasia Painter, and I just want to say thank you to the Immigration History Research Center, the Department of American Indian Studies, and to everyone that has helped make this happen. And of course, to all of you. I don't take it lightly that you're here with me, and thank you for inviting me into your offices, into your living rooms, into your kitchens, wherever I am. It feels really good. Okay. So I will start actually on the second slide here. This is a favorite photo of mine, but I digress. Okay. The US-Mexico border cuts through the traditional homelands of dozens of indigenous peoples. In southwestern Arizona, it cuts through O'odham. O'odham are indigenous peoples to the Sonoran Desert, pictured here, you can kind of see. And Juvid is our collective home. It extends roughly from Phoenix, Arizona in the north to Guaymas, Sonora in the south, to just past the San Pedro River in the east, and to Indio, California in the west. Uh, and on the next slide, you'll see the 21 federally recognized tribes and reservations in Arizona. I've highlighted the four federally recognized O'odham communities in yellow. So my community is the northernmost and the littlest O'odham community at the top, South Salt River. Going down, we have Gila River. Hopefully you can see that. It's kind of a big stretch, follows the Gila River as it's named. And then going further down, Ak-Chin, and finally the O'odham Nation. O'odham Nation, which abuts the border for over 65 miles, enrolls members or it claims citizens from and on both sides of the border. Hiachin O'odham is an unrecognized O'odham community, but it claims much of the western area. of the desert there that also abuts the border. As you can see, Atam Juvid, our homelands, are not only bifurcated or parsed up by the international border. Over time, they've also been parsed and bounded by various international borders, so internal borders. And these borders, like the international border, which gets the most attention, these internal borders belie our connections to each other and belie our claims to our traditional homelands. So generally, I work to rethink the US-Mexico borderlands through indigeneity. I work to recast border histories and politics into indigenous vocabularies, territories, and timelines. Here I have Hashan, or the saguaro cactus. She's my best friend. I love her. But today, as a brief intro into my work, I want to focus a little bit more on the border on its own terms, because the geopolitical construction and materialization of the border constitutes one of the clearest ways to get, I think, at the intersections between indigenous and immigrant as categories, historically and peoples, historically and in the present. Okay. The US-Mexico border is young. The immigration politics and policies it's become a metonym for are even younger. Today, I want to offer just a little timeline. And as I go through it, I want to keep my eyes on indigenous lands. So the US-Mexico border was established less than 200 years ago. To put that into perspective, this tortoise, Jonathan, the Seychelles giant tortoise, who is alive and well, eating veggies as we speak, is older than the border. Not the border wall, but the border itself. Okay, next slide. The border was established on paper in two legal transactions between the United States and Mexico at the conclusion of the Mexican-American War. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, and the Gadsden Purchase, 1853, established the line along the Rio Grande River in the east. Makes a certain sense. But in the west, it cuts rather bluntly through what is called the desert and we'll recognize now as Atam Juvid. To the officials that crafted the border, it made no difference that the border would impact dozens of indigenous peoples. It certainly made no difference to them that between the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Gadsden Purchase, the border went from clipping the top of Atam Juvid to slicing through its center. Negotiating officials never inquired into the desires of indigenous peoples. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo mentions indigenous peoples once. In Article 11, the United States agreed to prevent or punish incursions into Mexico by what it called savage tribes. They're talking about Nde there, or Apaches. In the subsequent Gadsden Purchase, indigenous peoples don't appear at all. Can you go to the next slide? These transactions negotiated by far-away officials were about territory. The border wasn't yet quite about immigration, which at the time had no meaningful restrictions. When the U.S. Boundary Commission, the white men in charge of marking the new border, passed through Atam Juvid in 1854, Secretary Thomas Webb, looking at the land he was surveying, wrote, "Is this the land?" Oh, sorry, I switched them. This is John Russell Bartlett. "Is this the land which we have purchased and are to survey and keep at such a cost? As far as the eye can reach stretches one unbroken, vast, barren, wild, and worthless. It is a desolate, barren waste, which can never be rendered useful for man or beast, save for a public highway." Secretary Thomas Webb, looking at that same landscape, okay, next slide, wrote, "Indeed, much of this country, that by those reading at a distance is imagined to be a perfect paradise, is a sterile waste, utterly worthless for any purpose other than to constitute a barrier or natural line of demarcation between two neighboring nations." Webb and Bartlett saw Atam Juvid, the desert, as good only for a border and for a highway, for demarcation and for transit, not for homes and communities. Literally and without irony, overlooking Atam farms, they imagined it as a wasteland. They imagined, too, that America's task was to make this land productive in a host of ways. I'll leave it up to Dr. Maruyama to talk about incarceration as one of the ways that US officials thought they might use our empty homelands. But let me keep an eye on the border, because for a while after it was established, the border existed only on paper. It has since, in many areas, emerged as a centerpiece for immigration politics, and it has materialized in concrete and steel. Next slide. For 75 years following the border's establishment, almost anyone could theoretically immigrate to the United States. The first categorical ban on immigration came at the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The next in 1917, which banned immigration from what lawmakers designated the Asiatic Barred Zone. Considering the current state of anti-immigrant rhetoric, focused on really hispanohablantes, it's amazing to think of the ways restrictive immigration policy was initially rooted in anti-Asian sentiment. But even then, for 75 years following the border's establishment, the border was effectively open for almost any non-Asian immigrants. That changed, historian May Nye has demonstrated, after the Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, which implemented strict immigration quotas set by country. Bureaucratically, it closed the borders of the United States. And in the process, it created the illegal alien as a legal subject. We'll use the term undocumented immigrant going forward. It created this subject to designate those living in the country without official authorization. Historian Kelly Lytle Hernandez has demonstrated how this played out logistically at the border, outlining how Border Patrol, which Congress established the same year as it passed the Immigration Act of 1924, was deployed to police this newly made category, and which, as an organization, would come to imagine its main object as Mexican, specifically Mexican border crossers. In my work, I found evidence of officers threatening to deport O'odham people, Indigenous people enrolled in O'odham communities as early as 1934. Even as the border became synonymous with immigration politics and emerged as a site of active immigration enforcement starting in the 1920s, another 70 years passed before militarization remade, in the words of Joseph Nevins, was remade into the militarized Leviathan it represents today. 30 years ago, in 1994, only 25 miles of the border were reinforced with some kind of physical barrier. Physical barriers constitute one of the most basic forms of military technology. In January of 2025, fences and walls marked and reinforced 702 miles of the nearly 2,000-mile-long border. Moreover, today, barriers constitute the lowest form of technology at Border Patrol's disposal. Agents also deploy helicopters, underground sensors, surveillance towers, drones, weird walking robot dogs, all in the hopes of stopping undocumented border crossers. All of this has arrived in the last 30 years. It's hard to quantify the impact of border militarization on O'odham people, but it's ubiquitous. O'odham cross for ceremonies, for births, funerals, weddings, as part of their everyday practices, and of course for special occasions. Increased militarization, surveillance, and Border Patrol officers who don't have a clue as to where they are makes all of that more difficult. The border constitutes the arena through which I imagine in my work the intersections between Indigenous and immigrants. Some of these intersections are found in proximity, in policing of brown people broadly. Others are embodied. So there are many O'odham who are not US citizens, who were born in Mexico, live in Mexico. And moreover, thinking about the Indigenous people who have been traveling through the Americas since the beginning of time. I want to conclude with a thought, and this is my last slide. In November of 2025, Leticia Jacobo, a 24-year-old member of Salt River, my community, and a US citizen, was mistakenly held for ICE deportation in an Iowa jail. If you didn't hear about it firsthand, you can imagine the outrage. She's not the only Native person who has been caught up in the ICE machine. However, I think it's short-sighted to chalk this up and these up to mistaken identity. It's a mistake only in the most immediate sense, but it hints at something more profound. Taking a step back, the border, which in recent years has come to encompass the whole of the country, was always meant to solidify, codify, and showcase a settler claim to indigenous lands. It has become a means with which to arbitrate who belongs and who the land belongs to, and for the settler state, its ownership is tacitly asserted in policing the opposite, in who it excludes and polices, which communities it militarizes. Indigenous peoples and those imagined and posed as undesirable immigrants find themselves on the same side of that insertion and assertion. But this, like the border itself, is a carefully crafted and constantly renewed fiction, one with a history that we can trace. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hana Maruyama. I don't have any slides, unfortunately. I am really happy to be here today with you. I'm the grandchild and great-grandchild of Japanese Americans who were imprisoned at Heart Mountain, Jerome, and Gila River during World War II, and we actually just passed the anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066 on February 19th. Which made me really appreciate that Gerald Ford finally rescinded Order 9066 in the 1970s, because I really can't imagine how it would have been wielded today. Right now, in its efforts to expand migrant detention to unprecedented levels, the Trump administration is relying on the Alien Enemies Act, which was last used 80 years ago to detain Japanese immigrant community leaders. Barbed wire fence from Crystal City internment camp was repurposed for the border wall on the southwestern border. Crystal City, for those who don't know, was used to kidnap and detain Japanese Peruvians who were later released as undocumented immigrants when Peru refused to take them back. It is located a mere 45 miles from the infamous Dilley Detention Center in Texas. And as David Chang and others have pointed out, the expansion of this carceral infrastructure also really relies on the infrastructure of American Indian dispossession. One example, as I'm sure the Minnesota folks know, is the Whipple building at Fort Snelling. During World War II, Fort Snelling was also used to train Japanese Americans as translators and interpreters in the military intelligence service. And my great uncle Kyo actually trained there while his family was imprisoned at Heart Mountain. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how federal agencies use settler colonial logics to develop Japanese American incarceration policy. I was working for the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation just after college when I was kind of stunned to learn that the Apsalake, or Crow, had been forced from the same site just 50 years before Japanese Americans were forced to Heart Mountain. I already knew that Gila River, where my grandfather and his family were sent, was on the Gila River Indian Reservation, which you just saw in the map Dr. Painter shared. When you look for it, traces of U.S. settler colonialism are all over Japanese American incarceration. Gila River wasn't even the first incarceration site on a reservation. Poston was not only created on the Colorado River Indian Reservation, it was also run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA, until January 1944. Loop, a boarding school on Navajo Nation land, was used for 9 months as an isolation center for Japanese Americans who were perceived to be troublemakers. In 1863, the U.S. military forcibly removed Paiute from the Owens Valley, which in 1942 would be converted into Manzanar. Tule Lake was on a site of the Modoc War. Minidoka is on Eastern Shoshone land ceded in the Fort Bridger Treaty of 1868. The WRA used Japanese American incarcerated labor to develop thousands of acres of land at Tule Lake, Minidoka, and Heart Mountain that were then auctioned off post-war in homesteading lotteries for veterans. Amachi, a popular nickname for Grenada in Colorado, was named after a Cheyenne woman, Amachi Prowers, as Bernadette Perez has shown. And more than 80 American Indian and Alaska Natives, either because of their mixed Japanese American heritage or because of their family ties to Japanese Americans, experienced incarceration in assembly centers and or the permanent, semi-permanent U.S. concentration camps that followed. Several WRA staff came from the BIA and returned or were transferred there after the war. Most notable among these was WRA Director Dylan Meyer, who was appointed as Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1950. He frequently justified his emphasis on rapid Japanese American resettlement as an attempt to avoid creating, quote, something akin to Indian reservations. As BIA commissioner, he pushed American Indian relocation policies that eerily echoed his approach as WRA director, pushing American Indians off reservations into menial labor roles in urban areas. He even used the same euphemism for this term, relocation. Many Indian Affairs employees who had worked for Meyer on Japanese American incarceration, including Commissioner John Collier, saw the parallels. When Meyer came up for reappointment in 1952, Collier called it, quote, a thinly cloaked design to embark on a withdrawal program for the Indians similar to the authoritarian, racist, and stereotyped administration which he directed for the Japanese Americans in World War II. These connections were actually not just made by the government. Unangan, removed from the Aleutian Islands, worked with Japanese Americans to pursue shared redress in the 1980s. Though the Unangan weren't removed under Order 9066, the BIA was involved in the management of both of these programs. Poston was managed by the BIA until the end of 1943, and this stands actually in very stark contrast to the systemic neglect and abuse that Unangan faced in abandoned canneries and boarding schools in southern Alaska. At Poston, sanitation engineers ensured that sewage was disposed of safely, and even then, Gila River had a street that was called Sewer Lane because the pipes leaked so badly, so it wasn't great. But such basic consultations didn't even occur at the Unangan concentration camps, and the extreme stress on these derelict sewage systems quickly contaminated local water sources, as Holly Guys has shown. These conditions, along with food shortages and sporadic, indifferent, and even abusive medical service, aggravated the spread of disease and led to a mortality rate of 1 in 10. And this was 3 times its pre-war rate in the community and almost 7 times higher than Japanese Americans' death rate in camp. So just to give a parallel. Of course, it's one thing to show that these connections existed in hindsight, but I also want to show that these settler colonial logics were filtering into the policy-making progress back in 1942. So in early April, after a disastrous and short-lived attempt at voluntary removal, the War Department and the War Relocation Authority, or WRA, the agency tasked with managing the removal and incarceration, meet with the governors of Western states. These governors almost all insist that they will not accept Japanese Americans in their states except under armed guard, and they demand these assurances that the incarcerees would be prevented by the federal government from acquiring land by purchase or lease and would be removed by the state at the end of the war, among other things. Accordingly, the WRA would strategically regulate the release of Japanese Americans into specific communities to appease surrounding white communities and prevent the buildup of public opposition to them. That spring and summer, these agencies reviewed more than 300 sites. The actual site selection criteria differ a little depending on what records you consult, but at a staff meeting on April 29, 1942, Robert Cousins, who led the WRA's operations department, delineated their main goals in site selection process. The most salient for our purposes was number 4, which said little displacement of white settlers. This demonstrates just how candidly the WRA was prioritizing the protection of white settler property in its site requirements. Now, this meeting took place more than 2 months after discussions about Poston, the first incarceration camp on an American Indian reservation, began. The Colorado River Indian Reservation really only came to the attention of the War Department when Los Angeles officials, alarmed at the War Department's interest in the Owens Valley, lobbied for an alternative that wasn't close to the city's largest water source. So they pitched the Colorado River Indian Reservation. A week later, BIA Commissioner John Collier also pitches Colorado River and 7 other sites on reservations with, quote, the possibility of using some of the irrigated lands on Indian reservations for the employment of Japanese aliens taken into custody by the United States Army. These pitches frequently emphasized, and I'm working this in because Dr. Painter mentioned this, that the land was desert and was unused. And elsewhere, as I can discuss later in the Q&A if you wish, this has been used to really delegitimize and erase indigenous forms of land use and how they and their relationships with the land as kin. The War Department did end up selecting the reservation, but they also moved forward with Manzanar. On March 20th, 1942, Poston had already been under discussion discussion for a minimum of 24 days. And construction had already begun when BIA staffer J.C. McCaskill informed the Colorado River Indian community of the plans. As he later related to BIA Commissioner John Collier, I had to say to the council frankly that I believed it was too late to stop the project, even though they might wish to. I indicated that the president and War Department had the authority to place the Japanese on unused lands of the reservation without awaiting their consent. His words demonstrate an awareness of the strong possibility that they might wish to stop the project. The implied threat that the War Department might not await their consent also really demonstrates the impossibility of actual consent under these conditions. A month later, the BIA did almost exactly the same thing, but with even more notice at the Gila River Indian Reservation. In that case, BIA Superintendent A.E. Robinson took the implied threat quite a bit further when he spoke to the tribal council and urged them not to take any action in opposition, since such action would be entirely futile and only tend to develop an attitude toward the tribe not to their best interests. Despite this, both communities initially refused to provide any form of consent. The Colorado River Indian Community Council would never sign a lease, although the BIA also essentially dropped the issue because it was managing Poston and didn't feel the need for a written agreement, even though this was a stated requisite for their agreement with the WRA, and the Creek Council had actually asked the agency to open discourses around negotiations multiple times. The WRA and BIA did put considerably more pressure on the Gila River Indian community to sign a lease agreement, and they threatened the council with loss of rental income for every day they refused to sign. The community was still recovering from a decades-long famine caused by the damming of the Gila River, and even so, they resisted for more than 6 months, ultimately only signing it in October 1942. So shortly after these negotiations, the WRA met resistance from the Rodders, a couple whose farm was surrounded by land the WRA planned to use for Heart Mountain. The Rodders wrote to various officials, including their Wyoming senators and the president, and the War Department and War Relocation Authority first contemplated multiple options. They thought of building them their own access road and giving them a pass so they would be able to come and go as needed. Ultimately, they just decided to change the camp boundaries to avoid the Rodders' land altogether. While the federal government did seize some private property under eminent domain, it did pay for those land holdings, and usually the landowners were amenable to the terms of purchase. It was frequently actually the tenants who opposed these sales, and even then, the WRA permitted tenants at sites like Grenada and Topaz to finish their harvest before claiming the land. So again, they protected white settler property, the crops, even if they didn't protect their livelihoods, the farms they were sharecropping. In contrast, Japanese American farmers were forced to farm their lands up until the removal and then transfer their crops over to a lessee or buyer who would sow the harvest and then frequently get a sizable portion of the profit. That the federal government could move forward with Poston and Gila River because it was held in trust and therefore could be treated as federal land that could be taken away without consent, while altering the site boundaries to protect white settler private property highlights the discrepancies in priorities when it comes to that little displacement of white settlers we mentioned earlier. And conversely, it's unwillingness to prioritize American Indian sovereignty. Clearly, the U.S. persistently protected and advanced white settler property in its Japanese American incarceration policies while disciplining Japanese Americans incarcerated labor to serve the expansion of white settler property and assaulting native sovereignty and impeding their ability to steward their remaining lands in doing so. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, so I'm going to go ahead and begin. Let me stop. So I write and research about the lives of indigenous people from southern Mexico, specifically the state of Oaxaca, who in the 1980s and early 1990s crossed the U.S.-Mexico border in larger numbers than before. Through stories shared by these community members, oral histories, archival and personal records across both countries, I tell the story of how this generation of migrants carried and transformed their communal worlds and propelled themselves as historical actors who were at once indigenous, migrant, worker, and Mexican across two countries. The constellation of actions migrants enacted to simultaneously address their needs in the places they lived created a cross-border and indigenous migrant grassroots social movement that advanced their autonomy and created a new political language about themselves as indigenous people. And while the physical movement of individuals from Mexico across the US-Mexico border is often told as a story of a homogeneous Spanish-speaking Mexican population, my work suggests another side of this story. Rather, indigenous people from Oaxaca reveal a world of communal relations and kinship, more than 16 languages with hundreds of variants, and their distinct practices and worldviews that bounded one another with their particular homelands. When they traveled throughout Mexico as they ventured further north of Oaxaca, the colonial conditions their homelands faced alongside the Mestizo State project of eradicating communal life heightened the racially asymmetrical conditions they confronted in the fields and urban centers of Mexico. The period of the mid to late 1980s became significant because the Mexican economic crisis, informed by U.S. imperial influence and Mexican elites, had disrupted Mexican society at large, once again displacing people from their homes without protection. Indigenous people faced this as another wave of the Mestizo State project of eradicating indigeneity. In other words, the state attempting to rip them apart from their communal life, their languages, and their homelands. Many more began to travel north. It's during this period of the 1980s that a cohort of indigenous activists whose families and kin migrated domestically for decades, and some born outside of Oaxaca, crossed the colonial US-Mexico border. This cohort had bilingual language skills that helped them navigate mestizo society and also training in the Mexican left, liberation theology, the teacher and agricultural struggles of Mexico, or local land and political movements of the era that shaped their perspectives. As they labored in the fields and urban centers of the United States, this cohort witnessed firsthand their fellow community members exploited and at the bottom of a racialized labor hierarchy. They understood that when they and their community members crossed the US-Mexico border, they were racialized and nationalized as Mexican, further encountering another erasure of their indigeneity. Although among Mexican communities there are clear distinctions about who is indigenous and who is not, being amalgamated as one homogeneous group reinforced the racial hierarchies of Mexico that were brought to the United States, which compounded their conditions within the US racial capitalist system. Indigenous people were placed in precarious labor and living situations, leading to wage theft, immobility in labor, and being forced to follow the migrant circuit while being charged exorbitant prices for transportation and crowded housing. They were threatened and experienced the violence of the INS U.S. Border Patrol and exposed to premature death with no distinction to their indigenous experiences. And yet, as this cohort of migrant activists also witnessed, their communities in diaspora had maintained bonds with one another and recreated their communal lives across 2,000 miles. This cohort of indigenous migrants that came of age in the 1980s tapped into the communal networks and currents of their respective communities in the United States and in Northwest Mexico to make noise and protest, to write and publish about their lives, and come to the defense of their people across borders. In the San Joaquin Valley of the Greater Central Valley of California, the foundation of the indigenous migrant movement through these dynamics became the basis for young Mixtecos to mobilize their community against the INS Border Patrol raids in 1992, which I will now briefly share. The story begins with the Mixteca Teresa Ramos, born in the Mexican migrant circuit outside her community of San Miguel Aguacates. In 1977, Teresa Ramos and her siblings crossed the US-Mexico border with their mom to Farmersville, California, a small city with a population of nearly 5,000 in the San Joaquin Valley. As Ramos entered her teenage years in the 1980s, an increased number of Mixteco migrants, and primarily men, began to arrive to the valley to work in labor-intensive crops that ranged from fresh fruits, vegetables, and nuts. Farmersville became one of the cities among many, including Livingston, Madera, and Fresno, where Mixteco hubs were formed as these migrants arrived to meet the seasonal labor needs of their region, a key site for the U.S. economy. During this time, the growth of the indigenous migrant population increased, and self-defense organizations with a strong emphasis on their respective pueblos or community of origin were formed. In 1986, the ACBJ was formally founded in Fresno, led by the Mixteco Filemon Lopez and other migrants from San Juan Mixtepec, after organizing in Oregon and in Florida years before. In 1985, Mixteco Rufino Dominguez and his paisanos, countrymen from San Miguel Cuevas, brought Opeo from Sinaloa, Mexico to Livingston, California. These organizations often operated like immigrant hometown associations, and yet at the same time, these members and their organizations were bounded by the codes of conduct of what made them communal citizens of their indigenous pueblos. The commitment of a lifelong obligation of service that they were guided by since childhood informed their actions to defend their communities. No action could be enacted without consensus. And so members in the organization traveled to the fields and the places from which indigenous migrants lived, labored, and just enjoyed their lives. They hosted Know Your Rights workshops, protested in front of the Border Patrol office after the death of a young indigenous man, Ismael Ramirez, in 1986, and were recognized as a force in the Central Valley that Oaxacan politicians and presidential candidates began arriving for their support. Over the course of the next few years, they created a presence and placed indigenous people from Oaxaca at the forefront. By 1991, they began having hemispheric conversations and joined the movement against the quincentennial celebration of the discovery of the Americas in 1992. This is the world Teresa Ramos came to learn when she returned to the Central Valley in 1992 after years in Los Angeles. On November 5th, 1992, Ramos received a phone call from her sister that the Border Patrol had forcefully entered their neighborhood in Farmersville in the early morning. In the sweeps, the Border Patrol apprehended 61 people in the city, taking many of her paisanos. Ramos was furious. As the day progressed, Ramos began to call everyone she knew to tell them there would be a march against the local police INS collaboration. The plan was to go straight to the chief of police in Farmersville and denounce these atrocities. She encouraged older Mixteca women to call the United Farm Worker radio station to let them know what had transpired. She reached out to the California Rural Legal Assistance and the Mixteco organization ACBJ. Ramos also reached out to the local Mecha chapters. The Chicano students asked Ramos what she needed them to bring, and she told them, "Bring your signs." The following afternoon, Ramos, the people of her neighborhood, and allies gathered and started marching to the police department to denounce the police INS collaboration. She recalled, "But as we were marching, we got to a corner and we just stopped. We blocked everything. We never expected that. And then the police came." About 300 people blocked the intersection of East Visalia Road and Farmersville Boulevard at 5 in the evening. Farmersville Police Chief Gary Meek noted how Ramos and other protesters had taken over the intersection in less than 15 minutes. This was the first time the city had seen such actions. To disperse the growing demonstration, the Farmersville Police Department called several agencies for assistance. Nearly 100 police officers arrived, and after shoving people, the police arrested Ramos and 10 others on charges of inciting a riot and failing to disperse. With the support of community members, including ACBJ, Ramos was released and formed the Committee for Humanity and Justice in Farmersville. The committee called for an end to the collaboration between police and INS, as well as calling for the chief to resign and for all charges to be dropped among those arrested. Filemon Lopez of ACBJ recalled a decade later that the INS raid stopped in Farmersville after the work of Ramos and the people of the city. The efforts of Ramos and her community in Farmersville drew on their own communal lives and institutions, supported by the political currents that the cohort of indigenous activists of the 1980s had forged. Though undocumented Mexican and Latin American people were under attack by the ongoing raids of the late 1980s and early 1990s, Ramos's actions in this context reveal that we cannot solely understand the history of Mexican immigration through one lens. As these indigenous migrants were at the bottom of the U.S. racialized labor system, the actions by Ramos and her community also demonstrate that they were not simply one small migrant community located in Farmersville. Through the ties that bound these Mixteco and pueblos from Oaxaca with one another along the migrant circuit and with their homelands, they became one node in a larger movement by migrants for their rights as indigenous people. Thank you.
What a thrilling group of presentations. I am inspired and very excited. And I'd really just first like to thank Liz and Fantasia and Hannah and Jorge for these because a table has been set for us where we are able to think about this in a far more complex way than we might have imagined, right? The way that that immigration is of non-indigenous people into indigenous lands, the way that the way the creation of borders forces indigenous people into acts of transnational migration despite their sovereignty over their lands, the indigeneity which is hidden within the assumed unanimity or the assumed unity of the quote unquote Mexican migrant subject, the imposition of the geographies of settler colonialism on incarcerated Japanese subjects, all of this, and then a deep, deep historical root, giving us ways of thinking about migration and welcome and and refugee status and the incorporation of other within a community coming to Liz's presentation. So first of all, I just want to kind of point out what we've seen. We've seen 4 centuries and we've seen theoretical depth and we've seen a range of kind of experience and scholarship. So I would also like to invite all of you are here as in our webinar today to go to the question and answer portion of feature on Zoom and to put in a question. We really want to hear from you, and I know that the panelists will want to respond. But I do get the right to ask a first question, and I feel I'm going to take that right, and I'm going to enjoy it. So first of all, thank you guys, and it's a somewhat predictable question, but I'd like to invite you all, given kind of how I framed this at the beginning, if you would, but also given the political urgency of the moment, to reflect on the possible, not certain, possible intersection of the stories that you've told with the current moment which we inhabit. Would you point to connections, to similarities, to antecedents that would help us to understand this present? Um, or would you perhaps point and emphasize that we could learn a lot from making a distinction between the past that you talked to us about and the present that we inhabit? If you have any thoughts on this, I would really like to learn from you, and I know that we all would. So I just invite you to unmute yourself and share your comments.
I can go first if that's helpful. I think a lot of Japanese Americans from my conversations with other community members are very scared of what is happening right now and feel very strongly that um, I think a lot of us had kind of hoped that what happened to our community would not happen again. And we are, without a doubt, seeing it happen again. And I would say in some ways we are seeing it happen with conditions that are probably worse than what a lot of Japanese Americans experienced. And that is very scary to me. That these, I mean, at least in Japanese American incarceration, they were attempting in some small way to preserve family structures. Like they were removed as families. Yes, Japanese immigrant leaders were removed and separated off, and there was family separation, but it wasn't kind of the widespread kind of family separation that you're hearing about here. They were put into barracks. They all had to share one room, but the family, as long as some members stayed together, were kept together. I think that in itself is different. There were food shortages, at least initially, but eventually they began to farm their own produce and stuff. And so that also kind of improved their condition. They were allowed to improve their conditions for themselves. That just doesn't seem to be something that is happening here right now. So I think we do need to be comparing this to the past. And I think we should also think about other carceral systems that I think we've seen really good comparisons to the Jim Crow South, to slavery to, I would say, American Indian boarding schools are another really salient moment that we should all be thinking in conversation with, because the US in many ways was founded on the detention of people it did not want to include fully.
Thanks so much, Hannah. That was a really terrific kind of opening to that question from David. Yeah, I mean, I think that in many ways, the acceptance and naturalization of the US as the only authority and the only government that should be able to make policy for who is welcome here and who gets to belong is part of this much larger piece of structural violence. My presentation obviously was the earliest in time and the most, in some ways, removed from contemporary politics. But I think losing sight of that distant past is part of how we've come to accept that American Indian tribal governments are somehow removed from or only reactive to this most recent wave of violence from the American state. I think, as I gestured to at the end of my presentation, the rise of American Indian Indian nationhood as a thing that is a racial component primarily, as opposed to a governance and a nationhood thing, is part of the problem here. And to put this in real concrete terms, what I mean is that under current federal policy, I would be unable tomorrow if I decided to adopt a child, let's say I legally adopt a child, I can never make that child a Peoria citizen unless they are of Peoria blood and descent. I can never make my husband a citizen of my nation despite the fact that we are wed, right? This works contrary to many of the ways we think about naturalization and immigration or bringing people in within modern law. I think the other part of this is that historically, what I see again and again is American Indian communities offering sanctuary to outsiders. I think this both helps us understand why so many Native communities gave refuge or gave land to European newcomers, but we also did this for foreigners who are also Indigenous people. But the removal of that conversation entirely, right, of American Indians from being able to participate in conversations about who should be welcome here, can tribal nations offer sanctuary to migrants? I don't know a lot of nations who, in this political climate and with the Supreme Court, would take a gamble on trying to offer sanctuary to migrants or trying to think about this. But this is stuff that comes out of federal policy, comes out of the violence of racializing Native people. And speaking of the Supreme Court, just to put another kind of concrete example of this in front of y'all, in 1846, in what's now Arkansas and what was Indian Territory, Cherokee Nation, the Supreme Court had a really important ruling in U.S. v. Rogers, is the court case. And this is a conflict wherein one man killed another man within Cherokee Nation. And what the Supreme Court hinged on was that the two men involved in the murder were both married into Cherokee Nation. So had been born as US citizens, were white, but had functionally been living and accepted as part of Cherokee Nation for decades within Cherokee families. And the Supreme Court basically said that these folks are no longer, they don't fall under Cherokee governance because there is no way for white US citizens to give up their citizenship and to become Cherokee. And I think this is a really important and overlooked moment in the codifying of these racial notions of American Indian identity and political belonging. And this is part of what I think gets us to this current moment. Rather than being all doom and gloom, though, I will end by saying that also in my neck of the woods towards Oklahoma, I've been really inspired by watching Choctaw Nation ally with non-Choctaw neighbors to fight against the opening of another ICE detention facility in Durant. And so I do think there are ways that tribal governance is still able to push back in this grim moment.
Thank you, David, for the question, everyone else. So one of the things that I want to kind of highlight is that, the kind of movement that I'm writing about in my work, you really see the same kind of political currents or influence exist today. And so, I've been fortunate to be connected with many of these individuals who, yesterday they had a meeting in Salinas, California, and a lot of the work that they've been doing, these different migrant organizations, has been to pay attention in terms of, you know, um, the kind of context of what we're dealing with, right? And so a lot of what we've seen is that uh, the ice rates that have continued expanding, especially on the central coast of California, where I'm at, is also a kind of larger kind of international labor issue in the sense that you have this kind of expansion of the H-2A guest worker program, especially in the Central Coast in Santa Maria, Oxnard, Salinas areas. And so we often see that the guest worker program are often people from the same communities of Oaxaca, who are brought in as guest workers and then kind of pitted against the undocumented, Oaxaqueño community. And so so folks start seeing like this is something that, the idea is that over time, the kind of growth of the undocumented kind of movement has had such an impact that, especially as workers, right, have achieved some successes in many ways. And so the H2A, I don't know if I'm confusing everyone, but the H2A has also been a kind of response to that in the sense of, guest workers, can't negotiate or bargain freely over their wages, right? They can't complain if they get injured, right? That they get sent back. And so we start seeing these kinds of ways in which they're kind of competing or forced to compete against one another, but also in terms of employers really looking towards H2As as the kind of ideal kind of worker in the sense of, and so we start seeing these connections where the ice raids that have increased in Santa Maria or the Central Coast, right, are as a result of creating this notion that there's a lack of workers who are willing to work and work in the fields. And so we start seeing these kind of connections. And so I've been in conversations with people who are, in San Quintin in Baja California, in the state of Washington, right, and throughout California in general, about trying to really mobilize and do something about, both the H-2A guest worker program, but also these larger aspects. And so I really see the work that I write about, right, it's 1980s, early 1990s, and it still maintains, right, this kind of current, this kind of way in which people are thinking internationally, especially Indigenous migrants who move internationally, think about their world, throughout the multiple places that they live and that their communities do as well, and are kind of recognizing these kinds of conditions that they're facing.
Should I add should I, okay, I'm
Please
gonna go.
do.
I'm thinking about similarities and resonances. And, I've long said that, not long, but what is happening right now in the United States in terms of ICE was incubated or has been incubating at the US-Mexico border. I think historians we talk about who focus on the US-Mexico border talk about deportation efforts. And this would be the third big deportation effort of specifically Hispanohablantes in the United States. So thinking about during the Great Depression in the 1930s, 2 million people were deported. 60% of them were US citizens. Um, and then we have I'm going to say it once, Operation Wetback, which is its official name, in response to the Bracero program, where it's considered the largest deportation campaign in history. It was also a publicity stunt. Um, and then we are now in this third mass deportation. And also, Operation uh, Trump modeled, right, talked about during his first presidency, the deportations that followed the Bracero program. Now we're in this third. So it is new and it is also old. And it is also rehashing things that have been happening. And at the same time, I think that we can also expand our ideas of deportation and removal to include the removal of Indigenous peoples. We could think about the 1830 Removal Act, by which 60,000 and more Native people of the Code 5 civilized tribes were removed. This has been incubated in the United States. And in my work, I like to trivialize. I think it's fun to say that I professionally think that borders are trash. That's my professional opinion. But it's very hard to trivialize. And the moment calls for really serious severity. And I think that so much of what is happening now has been developing. What's it called? So when dough rises, it's happening. I'm not a baker, is that obvious? But I mean to say that it's been in the oven and yeah, the bread is done. No, it's not a good metaphor. I tried it out on the road anyways, but thinking about this moment, I think it has deep historical roots, and those are both anti-immigrant and they began as anti-Indigenous, as it is at the core of the settler state and what it believes in.
The poisonous bread has risen and it has been baked now, huh? So I think that's perfect to transition. First of all, there's a number of people just singing praises in the comments, but there's a question that I think comes off very nicely off what you said, Fantasia, from Laura Maldonado, who asks that this made Laura think about what it means that we're focusing on indigenous migration intersections during times of crisis. And Laura wonders if you have thoughts about what happens if we also attend to quieter or more quotidian intersections or shared histories, even. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, yes. I mean, I think it's a wonderful point. I think what the question highlights is that we're thinking about this to some degree, right, in reaction to the stellar horror of this moment, right, and to what we're seeing unfolding and trying to think through other times and other moments of pressure and how our communities have responded collectively. I think I've been heartened to see, maybe only over like the last 5 years or so, but really the characterization and the focus on the streams of continual exchange between Indigenous folks across the hemisphere, right, as opposed to this sort of severing off of the US and Canada and then Mexico. But to emphasize the ways that these networks, these connections, Fantasia, highlighted really clearly for us, right, the transborderness of these for specific communities throughout time. But we also see these much older, much longer patterns of exchange and migration. I think on the American Indian front, one of the things that has sort of been minimized in our telling of our past and our history sometimes is the importance of migration for our own stories, not in moments of crisis, but as core to the foundation of our communities and the way we understand ourselves. Many communities have stories of moving from one place to another, of settling, of names for people who come into our communities at different points in time. And these are not often framed as emphasis of crisis. This is sort of our how did we get to be here and how did we become the people of this place? And I think to some degree in having to focus again for contemporary politics on insisting that we have always been here or we have always had specific kinds of rights, we may have overshadowed the way that Indigenous history across the continent is also fundamentally about mobility and exchange and migration, not always due to pressure, but due to long-standing and deep-rooted, extensive connections between families, between economies, and between regions. I don't know if one of my co-panelists wants to jump in as well, but yeah, it's a great question and critique.
And other co-panelists want to jump in?
Fermenting. I was looking for the word fermenting. It's been fermenting. No, I agree. I think you said it really well, Liz, which is that these are bigger questions. And I think part of what I really got from your talk too is that these questions about mobility and authority materialize in the everyday. And part of what happens on this quotidian, great word, on the quotidian is the assignment of who gets to say who has mobility and who gets to say who belongs. And so much of that boils down to our relationships with land, and whether or not we think of land as a relation. And I think, Liz, you do this great job of thinking about these responsibilities and reciprocities. And we could certainly counterpose that with the ways that national belonging takes place in the United States around these hard borders and boundaries. So I'll leave it there.
I just wanted to add, thank you for the question as well. And I think it's really powerful to think through moments when we don't have this kind of intense kind of crisis. And I think part of the way that I think about my work is that oftentimes it is these moments of crisis that we can see and that we can are so visible, which is why often I'm able to kind of capture this kind of very public history that I write about. But one of the things that I try to argue is that when these indigenous migrant cohorts, for example, or this cohort of activists, right, who are coming from Mexico into the U.S., much of what they've seen is, although their communities are in crisis and dealing with these conditions, right, of what it means to be at the bottom of a racialized labor hierarchy, they're also kind of creating, right? They're expanding, they're recreating their lives in a way that they've had to for different reasons, but they're also bounded by the relations of who they are, and this kind of lifelong obligation of providing service to their community. And so part of the way that I kind of think through it, right, is that there are those moments and aspects that are these kind of communal histories that these migrant activists kind of come into and see and recognize. And when there are these moments of crisis that happen upon these communities, they kind of tap into that network, right, to say, okay, we're connected from the different places in California to San Quintin to Oaxaca, but how do we mobilize that now at this particular moment? And so, for me, these moments of possibilities when they do organize themselves is possible because of those moments where there are ways in which they're recreating their lives and thinking about new ways of governing themselves across 2,000 miles, right? And asking themselves, how do we live in this particular way in this kind of rapidly changing world that we live in? And so I think that's the same for what we see, today in the present as well, right? That I know, for example, too, the in 2015 there was this other moment of crisis where the indigenous migrants from the state of Washington down to through California and to San Quintin, Baja California, 200 miles south of the U.S.-Mexico border, began a kind of general strike and stop production of agricultural um, you know, uh, of agriculture, right? And so you had Berry Mex in Mexico and Driscoll's in the U.S., and they kind of halted in kind of production in many ways. And so, but that really came out of these different moments in which, migrants were, right, conviviendo, when they were existing and relating to one another, they were trying to understand who they were, recreating their lives. And then there's these moments where you start seeing this kind of spark, right, where they kind of connect with one another. And so I think there are ways to think through those. And, I really also, I tap into that kind of work as well of scholars, other indigenous Oaxaqueño scholars who write about those moments, right, of when there is an intense crisis, but of course they're still dealing with these conditions. But it really helps us understand, right, the kind of sphere that indigenous migrants are kind of creating.
So hearing this question, I was initially like, I only look at crisis. But then hearing the other panelists speak, I think I was like, okay, no, you don't actually just look at crisis. So when I was hearing you all talk, I was like, no, there are actually like mixed race families that I've followed over the course of like many decades. And I think what their experiences really showed me is that care is something that it precedes crisis, it follows crisis, it is definitely hurt by crisis. And it also, I think, really emphasized looking at mixed American Indian and mixed Alaska Native families is that colonialism is an ongoing, persistent crisis that is always happening for Indigenous people. And so in some ways that crisis is kind of, it's happening in their healthcare, it's happening in their lives, it's happening in their ability to parent, right? And so that in some ways belies the idea that there is one crisis. There is actually like an ongoing, perpetual crisis that is happening, I think, here. And that sounds very depressing. So I want to actually share a story that I think shows kind of the beauty that can emerge out of these quotidian moments, which is a bust by an unknown artist at Gila River who was only known by his initials or her initials JS and created a bust out of cement, which I would suspect was probably stolen because they were not really funding public art projects at Gila River. They usually had cement and wood, and people would take it for their own purposes, but it was supposed to be for building stuff. And so he built this bust of, or she built this bust of this young girl out of cement. Her name is Sayoko Kawamura, and there were several more kind of around the camp. And when the Japanese Americans were forced to leave Gila River, the WRA just razed the site. They had said they would restore it to its original condition. They did not do that. They just destroyed it. And so Gila River Indian community member went to the site to gather like whatever he could find from the rubble, and he found this bust, and he picked it up and thought it was beautiful and took it along with a couple others and saw the shattered remains of others. So they had clearly raised the rest of them, and took them into his garden and kept them there for several decades. And eventually gave them to another person who gave them to the Hahugam Heritage Center, which is run by the Gila River Indian community, and is a phenomenal museum. I really encourage everyone to go see it if you get the chance and are in the region. But to me, what that shows is that they were caretaking the memory of Japanese American incarceration for decades. You know, when our community was not able to caretake it, when we had no will to remember that history, they remembered that it was important. They preserved that for us. And so to me, I think that is really the beauty and connection that comes out of those horrible circumstances.
Mahalo apiha. Thank you so deeply, all of you. Sincerely, from my own, I can tell from the audience and all the comments that this was meaningful to them. To me, just to finish, what you've done in this is, among many other things, you've shifted the perspective from gazing simply on the horror and the violence of the state to the perspectives of migrant people, of incarcerated people, of indigenous people, who are overlapping categories, right? And to see how are we not just a subject of history, but thinking history? How are we understanding? How is there an epistemology and an ontology that we can bring to this work to understand this and get beyond simply narrating the horrors of the state? Not to take away the importance of doing that. And for that, I want to give you my mahalo, my gratitude, and my thanks. And I also want to thank everyone who's come. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but we had these brilliant panelists and we wanted to hear from all of them. So thank you, everyone, for being here, for thinking, for moving this forward. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to Lana Barber and to the IHRC and the American Indian Studies Department. Have a good night.